NOAA. So we have a Great Lakes program that's been funded since 2012. So those are the 7 regions. And our budget has fluctuated in that time, but we have been kind of on the upswing the last few years. So we're sort of actively kind of thinking through now what it might look like if we get additional funding, if there's potential for regional expansion, or how we would better support the programs that currently exist. For example, in Chesapeake Bay, we've been really successful. Again, that's the longest program and the one that's the best funded. They get just shy of $3 million every year, traditionally. And they do a lot of systemic implementation of meaningful watershed educational experiences. So their grants are larger, they're 3-year projects, and they are focused on projects that work with entire school districts or at the state level to embed environmental education into a curriculum across a whole school district or multiple districts. And so that really helps ensure that, every student is going to have an opportunity to participate in this. It's not just a single school or, a couple of teachers who are really championing it. It's like working with the administrators to make sure that it's embedded and supported long term. And so that's something we've had success with in Chesapeake Bay, again, partially because there's this really supportive policy climate around it and commitments that are being made at the state level. But we're trying to do more of that in other regions as well, encouraging more of these systemic scale projects. So not the one-off funding a school for a year, but trying to, fund a district to build some infrastructure that can be sustained. So with that, those are generally, a bit more expensive and involve a different skill set and a different, kind of grantee to do that work. So it's possible that we will continue to emphasize that in some new areas, and that results in projects that look a little different than, our traditional BWET professional development and student-focused projects.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I didn't mention this earlier, but we do traditionally fund both professional development and projects that directly support meaningful watershed educational experiences with students. So ideally, there's a PD component so that, again, you have some capacity transfer and some ability for this to continue beyond the period of the grant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's exciting that things might expand either, within regions or beyond the current 7 regions.
Yeah, for sure.
You sound a little hesitant.
Well, I mean, it's always better to be talking about it in the context of expansion. When in the past when our budget has contracted and trying to figure out, and this is the tie back to evaluation, right? We have some programs that are smaller, have smaller levels of funding and have smaller projects, generally perhaps less ambitious objectives, and we aren't able to saturate a geographic area like Chesapeake. We've been able to fund a lot of projects in those states, and so you can really see kind of a change occurring from what, not just, I won't take all the credit for it, but we've been able to fund a lot and then see that kind of catalyze into a community of practice. Whereas in a place like the Gulf of Mexico, where we have a fraction, probably a quarter of the funding we have in Chesapeake Bay, and the geographic area is huge, and so effectively it winds up being, projects that are kind of more isolated from each other, more one-off, and then it's harder to see momentum come from that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bit of, I would like to see more, I guess, some of the programs that are not funded as well, we'd like to invest more in potentially if we can get them closer to a place like Chesapeake. But then at the same time, so if the conversation is around more funding, that's great. If it's around less funding when budgets are contracting, then it becomes kind of comparing, it's still obviously, in my mind, pretty worthwhile to be able to fund a project in a place that otherwise would not have access to that kind of programming. But you don't have maybe the potential for catalyzing systemic change across a state school district, and so balancing the priority for that can be hard, but better to be having the conversation in a climate of increasing funding. So
yeah. So with all of these 7 regions, especially because they are kind of differently focused and differently funded and everything, how did you first start working on collective evaluation? Like, what was the impetus there? What was the motivation behind evaluating all of them kind of in a unified manner? What did that look like?
Yeah, so going back to sort of the history of how the program started, those first 3 regions, Chesapeake, California, and Hawaii, were they were like their own lines in the budget, and they went to those regions of NOAA directly. And, you know, it wasn't until around 2008 when we expanded, or I think maybe shortly before that, before my time at least, which I started with the program around 2008, the funds all kind of got consolidated coming into the Office of Education. And we really started talking about it as a national program. Because before that, it was sort of, you know, we had this cool thing happening in Chesapeake. You know, we'd kind of taken that model, and now a cool thing was happening in California, and now, you know, Hawaii, and then, but they were still like regionally, you know, regional programs first and foremost. And it was really with the expansion in 2008 that we started thinking about it as a national program with different regional implementation. And I think with that, there was a greater recognition too that if we wanted to continue to, you know, to be able to document the effectiveness of the model and have opportunities to bring it to new places, and to continue to get funding for it, we had to really show, you know, that it was effective. It was an effective model and something that, you know, we had evidence to support making a case to EPA that, you know, hey, we can bring this great program to you in Great Lakes. So around the time I started with the program, that was very much, you know, in everybody's mind. There were also a lot of drivers, I think, at the federal level at that point, encouraging more evaluation, and performance-based management. So, you know, we had set aside some funds to do this, and then of course had to tackle, like, what does that look like? And how do we go about it? And so we had a lot of help. We started out, one of our regions in California had been working with an evaluation consultant on supporting project evaluation for their grantees. So it was someone who was reading through the individual project evaluations, providing feedback for the grantees and trying to help them strengthen their project evaluation. So she had a lot of understanding of the MIWI framework and, you know, what we were trying to do with the program. And so the first step we took was, you know, we had her kind of facilitate a group conversation about, like, what do we really want to know about this program? What are we going to want to say about it? What, you know, what would this evaluation look like? What kinds of outcomes would we be looking for, and what we want to prioritize? And so we definitely had like a professional evaluator helping us with that. We had a laundry list of outcomes coming out of that conversation that was way too long. But again, when you have, you know, 7 people in the room all bringing their own perspectives and interests, it was just like, it was a lot. But that's what we arrived at. And then, you know, a next step was we put out an RFP for an evaluation consultant to work with us on the program. And we selected one, which was at the time a joint, it was a collaboration with University of Michigan. So Michaela Sint was working on it. Anita Kramer, who was at ILI, the Institute for Learning Innovation at the time in its iteration in Annapolis. And Joe Heimlich was working on it initially as well. And I can't remember what his affiliation was at the time, but they had a kind of a, you know, great group proposal that came in. And then we had, as the first step in that whole process, we also at another group meeting had them kind of work with our laundry list of outcomes and really try to figure out, you know, what are the key evaluation questions that we can reasonably hope to inform through this project. And so they really helped us kind of focus that a bit, even though now 10 years later, almost, I can say, like, I think we still have kind of too much going on with our evaluation, you know, so hindsight's 2020, and it has been a decade, and we are actually this year planning, we're going to talk about this, planning to like do another analysis and consider maybe making some changes or revisiting what we're doing with our national evaluation. That's something that's